All right, thanks for joining us. My name is John Steiert. I am the content marketing manager at NetLine Corporation. I'll introduce these two wonderful gentlemen in a moment, but today we're going to be analyzing the consumption trends of IT buyers from the first half of 2021. So, again, as I just mentioned, the two other gentlemen that are with me today are David Fortino, my boss, the Chief Strategy Officer at NetLine Corporation, and Tim Hayden, the CEO of Brain+Trust Partners. Tim, first, you're our guest. Thank you very much for joining us. How are you today?
Doing great, John. I want to thank you and Dave for having me. This ought to be a great conversation.
Yeah, we were very happy to have you. Dave,
Definitely.
How are things?
Super.
All right, so today we're going to be talking about the consumption habits of professionals working in IT job areas. So basically folks who are specifically working in IT roles. And that could be, anybody working in a video game industry, working in HR, working in IT itself, which is obviously a big contingent of the IT world anyway. So this is between January 1st and June 30th of 2021. If you're interested in some of the larger consumption trends and pieces around that spot, we have available for download at netline.com/resources, our 2021 State of B2B Content Consumption and Demand Report. We're also beginning to work on the 2022 version of that, so look forward to that sometime in early Q1. Really excited about that. So for the first part of this conversation, gentlemen, we're going to be talking about the what as opposed to who. We're going to talk a lot about who here, but this is going to be explicitly about the what and what specifically was consumed. Again, we've talked a whole lot about, and Dave, of course, you know this like the back of your hand, the IT audience for NetLine, the platform, we see a ton of downloads, a ton of registrations. They're our largest audience, and no surprise here. Again, they are 27% of all requests during the first half of 2021. It's slightly down in terms of just, a number of downloads here and there, but roughly the volume is the same. And the nice thing too, as I already mentioned, the 2022 report, we are seeing a larger influx of volume of downloads anyway. So that probably gives the number as far as like why it's going down, quote unquote, putting it into some nice context. So anything you want to chime in here on, Dave?
No, not necessarily. I think the one thing that's interesting, and if we compare this back to 2020, that volume was a little bit greater due to the fact that there was a scrambling of sorts, as you can imagine, due to COVID. And although IT audiences were always our largest audience segment in terms of content consumption, they were never put under the pressure that they were at that moment, where every organization had to go fully digital. A lot of organizations just clearly weren't prepared to do so. I think clearly IT teams have settled into a groove now and have understood what it takes to run an organization from that perspective. So their behavior, I suppose, from the content consumption side of things has kind of fallen back into the levels that we would historically have seen.
Right.
Well, I think, Davey, too, if you just look at the fact that if what we're saying here is that the non-IT segment of the respondents, if that grew in 2021, it's the same logic, though, that because of the pandemic, right?
Exactly.
Digitization is something that people across the organization are acutely aware of now. And with that, they are ever more curious and interested in what it's going to take to accelerate the performance of whatever their job task may be.
Exactly.
It's a perfect amuse-bouche for what we'll be getting into later on in this presentation, this discussion. So hold those thoughts around COVID and consumption around the digitization of the working world.
And I love a good amuse-bouche. So
there we go. I knew.
Yeah.
I saw Dave smile when I said that, so I pulled that one out of my hat. I'm happy about that. Registrations by format. So we always see ebooks on our platform do extremely well. It's not a huge surprise that ebooks here are the dominant feature. They're the most consumed format across the board in 2021 and 2020. I'm sorry, in 2020 for the 2021 report. And again, because the IT audience is such an influential part, they're a reason why it pushes that number up. Of course, in the IT world, we see a lot of information that needs to be consumed very quickly. So cheat sheets naturally would be number two, along with stuff like how-to guides and tips and tricks, which we'll begin to see later on the line. The interesting thing about the ebook consumption here, it's about nearly a 6% increase compared to the rest of the larger audience. So the IT had a 6% larger influx of consumption here compared to the larger audience. Now, registrations by topic is a very interesting one because we begin to sink our teeth into what was actually consumed and some of the stuff that, Tim, I'd love to hear some of your thoughts on too. At the top here, we see Linux and cybersecurity and security in general, machine learning. We see data at the bottom. There's all sorts of stuff that we can dig into here. Tim, you just mentioned the digitization of the world essentially over the last 18 months, if not 2 years.
Right.
You work with a lot of companies in varying sizes, but I know that you continue to work with companies that are quite large. Are you seeing, because of the push and the influx of information about security and cybersecurity, is Linux tied into that? Do you think that might be why Linux is at the top here?
Well, I think there's a number of trend lines that are parallel here, right? There's what we've already started to scratch the surface on with the pandemic and the acceleration of digital transformation projects, of digitization initiatives. I think the other side of this is look at the microscope or really the center stage spotlight that's being put on big tech right now. Linux is, to many folks, is not Amazon, not Google, not even IBM. I mean, it's in folks' minds. I think they see Linux as an open standards platform, one where online forums, there is a tremendous amount of sharing of information on how to do things. Just what you said earlier about cheat sheets and how-to guides. Linux is just one of those things that over the years has progressively become a du jour choice, not an amuse-bouche, but a du jour. I think that's I think that is why we're seeing that at the top of the list more than anything else. Is it's an alternative to a lot of the off-the-shelf big tech that has been the object of most spend by both IT professionals and I think people across the marketing and customer experience communication suite who have in the last 5 to 10 years are spending as much on IT as somebody in IT is.
Completely agree.
Yeah, that's a great point. Dave, do you have anything else that you'd like to share?
To me, security is somewhat ever present, right? And that it's consistently top of mind. Clearly, the one element as it relates to security through COVID had less to do about external kind of hacking of infrastructure, more about securing your infrastructure from itself.
Right.
With employees going fully digitized and outside of the actual physical office environment, there's a whole new resurgence around what securing your actual data structure looked like, your data centers and so on. And that wasn't just about, external threats. It was just simply about data leakage, compliance, and so on, where in the office, all of that was tightly controlled. So that makes a lot of sense to me. We'll get to some of the AI findings a little bit later. The OS how-tos is curious. There hasn't really been a new OS in years. Windows 11's coming out soon, yet perennially it seems like there's still content that's needed to help people get more out of their own default operating system. And I guess that comes back to productivity. I think the other ones nicely tie into kind of what we were expecting to see. John, I don't know if you had any additional hot takes on this.
Nothing from a hot take perspective. I think you two did that very nicely. I just wanted to put into context basically what you can see here. Obviously, everything that is from a topic standpoint, it's based on volume, and then the appearance of each word based on each title that we ended up seeing in our consumption report. So not a huge surprise in terms of actually seeing, to piggyback off of what you just said, Dave, the operating system how-tos, we're always going to see that. There's always people coming into new tech roles that need to know something on the fly, regardless of how experienced or inexperienced they are. So yeah, this is always really interesting to see what is actually being consumed at a topic level. All right, let's begin to dive into the who. So unsurprisingly, again, to Dave and I, the US represented nearly 50% of all registrations. When we're talking about the folks who are loading in, uploading the content into our system, they're looking primarily for US audiences. So this is not a huge stunner. However, the piece that links the top 5 countries in terms of registrations, they all have English as a primary or a dominant language. So we're talking about India, Australia, South Africa, and UK. Obviously, there's a large contingency of English-speaking population. There's a large connection to the US in those different municipalities and countries. So not a huge surprise there. Dave, anything you wanted to touch on here?
No, I think just to provide additional context, when John had mentioned that folks are uploading content, we have a platform that effectively helps B2B marketers get content in front of contextually relevant audiences and only deliver leads or registrations that specifically meet filter criteria that the marketer decides. When you're deciding that, it does create this algorithmic kind of echo chamber, though. So if we are saying, yeah, if you're running a campaign looking to target US professionals within a certain industry, IT professionals in this case within a certain industry, the algorithm's going to concretely focus on that, thereby mitigating the amount of non-US IT folks that could ever see your content, and continues that circuitous loop until the campaign's done. That said, being that we're not just an ad network, there are a ton of people that organically find this content and register for this content that fall outside of the criteria of the campaign. That data doesn't get sent to the marketer, but the user still gets to participate and actually learn. That's very different than what you'd see like in the ad side of the industry, where if you're seeing any impressions delivered to a non-targeted audience segment, that's a problem because you're paying for those impressions effectively. But I hope that offered a little context as to how this all works, kind of how we're getting the data too.
Great, thanks for that, Dave. So getting into the organizational sizes, one of the things that, as Dave just talked about with our platform, how it functions, we categorize the different organizational sizes in 14 different specific categories, starting with the smallest from 1 to 4 and the largest at 50K plus. So starting with that 50K plus, there is a large representation of businesses at the top of the food chain, representing more than 10% of all consumption. The largest organizations, 50K plus, they actually were the second most likely to consume all content. And when we compare that to some of their brethren in the larger categories, specifically the 20K to just under 50K, the largest organizations in our food chain requested 104% more content. Now, that's really interesting when we consider who is at the top of the food chain. You're talking about companies like Amazon and Walmart and anybody else in that stratosphere. Tim, I know you've worked extensively with some of the companies in those realms. Is there anything from an IT standpoint that they're looking for that is really of interest to IT professionals in the content world today?
Well, I think what Dave already he hit the note on this, that the distribution of the workforce, especially in larger companies, right? Larger companies are the ones that have had to all of a sudden go from organizational development, HR policies to health policies and health protocols, right? And with that, you've got the distributed workforce. They're working remotely, and they're doing so on their own devices. That creates challenges with their own devices on their own home networks, right? So with that creates challenges when you want to look at content consumption and calculate attribution. That creates challenges with basically everything that we've already mentioned on security, right? So I think the bigger they are, the harder they fall and the more they had to lose, right? The more they had at stake as we've gone through this extremely challenging period of business history, if we can call it that. And I think that you've got IT teams, especially distributed IT teams, that are supporting specific business units that are under a tremendous amount of pressure when it comes to security, or even better than that, I think, is business continuity for the people that are on the front lines of the business, whether that's customer experience and customer or tech support, or if it's something in the sales or the marketing function, which you guys know very well.
Good job. Very well said.
So moving beyond the organizational size, we're going to talk specifically about some folks at the job level. Everybody is always interested in reaching the CEOs and some of the larger folks, and we'll talk about them in a second. But regardless of which industry we're looking at, which job area we're looking at, individual contributors are always the largest representatives of all consumption. So in this case, they represented nearly just over a third of all, or roughly a third of all registrations. It's a 2% increase year over year, and you might think 2%, that's not huge. It is, because you're taking away from a number of other folks who might be not consuming as much, or individual contributors, or just the ones who are sucking up more and more because they're being asked to take on more as their leadership teams and their directors are likely focused on maybe some other stuff. We've seen that across the board. And that gets to some of the other parts. Again, the C level, they're consuming content. We talked about it in our 2021 consumption report, Dave. We saw a slight dip in overall C level consumption, but senior employees and senior VPs more specifically were consuming a ton more content. And that is echoed here too, when you see senior employees consumed 600% more content compared to their C-level directors and their leadership.
Yeah, it's although this fluctuates a bit, the one commonality year over year is that the C-suite itself generally consumes 10 to 12% of all content across their platform. So putting that another way, 86% to 88% of content is not being consumed by the C-suite. That it then introduces that challenge, right, where you've got marketers with this preconceived notion that we need to enter the C-suite, we need to be influencing these folks. Well, it turns out that they're just simply not interested in engaging with your content, nor are they generally going to respond to your emails, especially marketing emails or phone calls. So the one commonality that you can extract here is, regardless of market trends, influencing the C-suite's influencers is integral to driving customer penetration, right? Whether you're talking about digital innovation and re-architecting a relationship with an organization, or you're simply just trying to start first with a dialogue at a very painless entry point. Trying to go through the C-suite, unless it's another C-suite person forging that dialogue, it's generally not going to happen.
Right.
Let's move into registrations by job area. So again, we are looking specifically at IT job areas, but there are, of course, within the world of IT, tons of other job areas. So we're going to get into, at this point, some of the differences between this year, 2021, compared to the shock and awe that was the first half of 2020 in regards to COVID. So you can see here that IT systems management professionals consumed nearly 40% less content this year compared to the last year. My theory here is, sort of as you guys have already touched on, IT systems were really, they were put to their paces the first half of 2020. And perhaps this year, as we're going to see in the next slide, they can take a bit of a step back and kind of catch their breath, because the systems have, for the most part, been bolstered. They've gotten a chance to catch up, and the folks that actually run those systems have been able to do the same. So they're kind of on equal footing. Comparatively, their counterparts, their teammates in general management, they're the ones who are now trying to figure out, how do I actually keep up with everything here that is now been added to our relative plates? So nearly 143% rise in overall consumption from general IT management pros. So again, I think this is all COVID related, and how the remote workforce has really made IT professionals readjust how they work. So to either of you, whoever would like to step in, I'm curious as to how you see these two specific stats and how they would be, relative in the contextual in the real world.
It looks like Tim had a thought, so I'll let him go first.
Well, no, I've got a couple of thoughts. I want to hear your take first, Dave, because I'm definitely going to react to it. I just got to be sure what I'm going to say.
So, my take on this one specifically is that we're now back in growth mode, right? People are planning for the future, and it's no longer about holding down the fort, right? We've held the fort, or we've lost the fort at this point. And it's about wherever you're at as an organization, you can't just continuously be stuck there, right? Business is always about the continuance and the future of wherever you're going.
Right.
And so, to me, this is encouraging in that we're not retreating into ourselves and saying, okay, well, we've hunkered down, we've stabilized the ship, and let's just keep doing that and keep things, keep the lights on and worry about mission critical items, versus, okay, we've done that. We've accepted that. The organization is where it is, whether it's fully distributed, hybrid, you name it, but we are still charging ahead. And now we're getting back into research projects. We're starting to understand where we need to have spend allocation, R&D, and so on. And so, to me, I think this is I hate to go overly sappy here, but it's an encouraging stat to, speak to the fact that maybe the world, although we're still living with COVID, is starting to think about a longer term future than just day-to-day, sustenance.
No, I think that's, you guys heard me say business or something about, or characterizing it as business continuity earlier, right? And certainly business continuity, keeping the lights on, was a remit at certain points for certain companies. Everybody at some point, I think over the last 24 months has had that happen to them. With the volatility even in the stock market, I think is
Sure.
created some challenges. But at the end of the day, I think you're absolutely right, Dave. I think folks are understanding that vaccination levels are up. People are smarter about how they are respecting what's gone on with the pandemic, and really how they have these wonderful new ways of connecting with folks remotely. I say that anecdotally. I've flown for business the last 3 Thursdays and Fridays. Been a victim of Southwest not having enough pilots and American canceling 20,000 flights, right? Or was it 2,000? Sure seemed like a lot. But when I'm in the airports as just a pulse read, there are a lot of business travelers that are back out there. They're in the saddle, and they're going out to have face-to-face meetings to understand that they can be absolutely probably more successful. Their conversions go up. The relationships are stronger before the conversions, right? All of this, I think, is buoyed by what we're seeing here with IT starting to invest more in know-how and learned new know-how on how to lift the performance of what happens with the business operation itself, whether that's sales or it's marketing or it's some other function.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And while Dave didn't get on a plane, he too was out back in the saddle, as you like to say, Tim. He was up in New York City with a different type of cowboy.
Yeah, it was intriguing. Not to go off tangent, but yeah, that was my first work trip last week, and in 20 months. And it was as if Manhattan is completely back to normal. The only differences are masks and vax cards, but aside from that, yeah, it was as if it was January 2020. So good to see.
Excellent.
Good stuff. A couple other things here. We've already touched on the general blanket that is cybersecurity and information security. But again, as people are more and more remote, the ability for organizations to keep things tighter has to be increased. So that would make sense as to why it was up 17% year over year. Let's get into some of the other pieces around sub-industry. This honestly is some of my favorite information that is in the entire report. Dave, I know you agree with me, some of the stuff that we've had discussions about. So where consumption increased. I'm going to leave that top one for last because it's the most interesting, and it relates to another one that's in the decreased column. So e-learning, not a surprise. We have seen a ton of whether it's high school, like my wife, who's a secondary or as it's better known, high school teacher. She has done a lot of virtual learning as needed. Consumer good consumption was up. People bought a ton of stuff over the last 2 years. It's been insane. It's one of the reasons why we're seeing all the different backlogs of goods in our shipping ports. So, and that ties directly into general manufacturing. As people are consuming more and more, they obviously need to create more and more. And obviously, computer and network security, we've already touched on a lot of that throughout this discussion. That's always going to go up in my purview as we go into the metaverse and things like that, where security is going to be tighter and tighter, or at least it needs to be. Getting back to the top, state and local government consumption increased more than 67% year over year. It's fascinating because it ties, as I said, directly into the next slide, where we can see federal government consumption decreased. Now, again, this gets into the COVID response. What we saw last year was everything was very centralized at the top. The federal government was the one dictating how things went, or where all the information was coming from. Everything was at the top and it was dispersed out. Now, as you guys were just talking about, as things are settling down, as things return more and more to normal, everything is more of a, how is your municipality, how is your local government going to treat it? How is your state specifically going to treat it?
Right.
Which would make sense as to why the consumption numbers have flipped. I think that's one of the most interesting pieces of direct real world consumption and need reflecting into our world. Just really interesting stuff.
Agreed. The decline of content consumption within the wine and spirits industry is interesting for IT folks, because I suppose I'd love to read a little bit more into that, but I believe alcohol consumption is still at record levels across the U.S., still due to most post-pandemic experiences. Yet consumption has flatlined. So I'm wondering if there's some internal knowledge there that perhaps that tendency of consuming as much content or as much alcohol as people have, is that if that is curbing and the industry is contracting. I'm not sure. That's pretty interesting to see. And I have no commentary on the general agriculture one. I'd love to, Tim, get your thoughts on that. IT professionals within the ag industry, I can't even connect the dots on that.
Well, and that's what's fascinating is agriculture is one of those industries that we've been watching at Brain+Trust for several years. It's one of the first places that robots have really started to take over so much of the value chain of what happens in the field, what happens in the processing and packaging of produce. But again, from a general content consumption standpoint, especially that which would be IT related or directional in terms of how to cheat sheets, white papers, those kinds of things. The best guess that I could give you for both general agriculture and wine and spirits is that there was a whole lot of aggregation and centralization of the channels over the course of the last 2 years, right? It was more folks that were going to home delivery services, that were doing curbside pickup at the grocery store, and with that, you know, folks are limiting their discovery to a menu if you think about that real quick. They're not being influenced throughout the week and building a shopping list the way they were before. I'm not saying that people don't do that anymore, but they do less of it because they realize they need to go to the grocery store, and rather than being able to walk at a leisurely pace for an hour in the store and fill your basket with the things that are on your list and the things that are impulse, now you're more direct with it. So
absolutely, yeah.
You know, it's just a guess I have in terms of where you'd see a little less consumption or a less focus in terms of looking at how to grow the market with when it seems like maybe logically over the last couple of years you could lean on the channel to do the work for you.
Yeah, it's interesting perspectives.
Yeah, that's really fascinating stuff. To backtrack very quickly on the wine and spirits, we wrote a little bit about this in a guest post on Marketing Insider Group blog, and we touched on the fact that Beam Suntory, who is the holding company for some brands like Jim Beam and Hornitos tequila, their specific consumption in the wine and spirits and just retail specifically, their consumption outpaced everyone else by a factor of 5 to 1. It was stunning to see the food production consumption there from them last year. So really interesting stuff there. I would imagine that if we looked back and saw what they were consuming this year, obviously that would be a really big factor as to why we're seeing a nearly 75% decrease there. The general agriculture one, Tim, I'm not going to step on anything that you just said. I think it's awesome what you had just commented on. But it's a nice transition into the last piece that we're going to talk about, which is everything in AI. Obviously, farmers are having to touch into technology in ways that we probably would have never expected even 20 years ago. They're using some fascinating pieces within AI and automation. But as much as we know AI is common throughout our lives in ways even that we don't acknowledge and think about all the time, like, you know, obviously we have phones everywhere, we have smart speakers everywhere. That's all powered in some way, shape, or form by AI. But we were curious, and this is all based on information that we just did via our intent discovery, buyer level intent discovery tool. We were curious to see what's basically going to take what it's going to take for some of these smaller companies, more average, if you will, companies to dip their toe further into the investment water in AI software, and specifically what their priorities would be. So, unsurprisingly, automating routine tasks is one of the top AI software priorities for any business when they're looking at trying to figure out what they're actually going to get into. And right there at the top with them is managing risk and mitigating it, perhaps, and then improved decision making with roughly 19% of all pieces. Tim, I see you shaking your head. I'm interested to see, I'm sure you see and hear a lot of AI software conversations as you speak to your clients and your prospects. Right. Anything from this first slide that you are interested in just chiming in on?
I mean, there's when I think about automation, really, you know, especially in the context, the contemporary context of business, because we're not meeting as teams the way that we used to, you know, because we're not all 3 days a week marching down to a boardroom and looking at reports and discussing them. That's tied to improved decision making, right? But I would think that more folks have started to understand if I have something that I do 3 or 4 times a week, a task that I do, there increasingly are software tools that are out on the marketplace right now. There are automation tools that I can license, I can subscribe to help me make that happen. I think that's a big thing that's happened there in the last 2 years. I think the other side of that, really, which we see the most at Brain+Trust, which is improved decision making. It's related to automation, right? It's how do we employ technology that liberates us to do what humans do very well, which is strategic thinking, decision making, creativity, those things that the machines yet just can't do. At least they can't They can't do it at scale or in specific verticals the way a lot of people would think that they would. But having clarity, right? Just having clarity on what to do next. And I think that's the thing as we look at, not to digress, but when you look at what Apple's doing right now to clench its teeth down with first of all, your ability to track an Apple user across multiple devices and apps, what they've done to halt that, or at least put the consumer or the Apple user in control. Quickly following that with iOS 15, right? And what we saw with a lot of folks, just all of a sudden, open rate dashboards went blank.
Yep.
That kind of thing that's happening, and Google obviously readjusting, moving the goalpost, if you will, with third-party cookie deprecation. I think lots of folks are starting to say, I need to leverage technology to help me do things faster. And one of those things, I think the primary thing is just have clearer insights to make better decisions.
Yeah, those are great perspectives, Tim. The one thing that stuck out with this data for me is I was somewhat disappointed to see improved decisions being ranked lower.
Yeah.
And honestly, it speaks to the fact that I suspect that there's a serious amount of AI hesitancy to actually say that I'm comfortable enough to let AI make some decisions or inform some decisions. I'm going to first, and you can kind of see it in this. We're basically saying, yeah, like take care of the busy work for me, almost as if it's a junior level person. But AI, when deployed correctly, should be helping the most senior level decisions to occur. Yes, automation of tasks is certainly something that can be done even without AI. There's enough programs out there that do that. The ability for AI to recognize patterns in things that humans generally can't, that's the real value there. But if humans don't really perceive there to be value and or trust the ability for a computer to do that analysis differently than you would do on a human basis, this is going to hover this way until there's a greater consensus of belief and trust that computers can provide a perspective that you otherwise couldn't have had on your own.
Well, Dave, I think if I can take just one little phrase that you threw out there, I think applying AI correctly, right? Leveraging it the right way. That in itself, is it trust that's the challenge, or is it the fact that every software as a service and technology platform vendor that calls me and asks to schedule the demo says that they have AI, says that they have automation or better insights produced by artificial intelligence or machine learning. And I think for IT decision makers and those in business functions they support are inundated right now. They don't know. This is what I think you guys can remember. This is not different than 10, 15 years ago when all of a sudden there were 150 different ways to measure what was happening in social media, and everybody latching onto that. So I'm not going to compare the two. I think AI is much bigger. There's more breadth. It's embedded. There's a lot that's happening there, and it's all around us already, whether we trust it or not. But I think it's the noise that's in the marketplace that has folks really, I think, confused and not knowing where to go to learn and find that true north.
It's because of the fact, though, that 99% of that noise is just vapor, right? An algorithm is not AI.
It's fancy math, right?
Yes. Yeah. This is something that we see in our industry a ton. You will not hear NetLine running around saying that we have an AI solution. We don't. We have a ton of very sophisticated algorithms that allow us to target audiences incredibly well. There are maybe a few dozen companies in the world that have super advanced AI, quantum level computers running super sophisticated algorithms and generating learnings and observations. Beyond that, everything else is somewhat more advanced algorithmic outputs, nothing more. Fancy if-then statements. Yeah, I wish that wasn't true,
But
Right.
that leads to this market suspicion, confusion, and so on. And that you've got a lot of people who are, especially if they're in the startup world, throwing AI into their positioning statement and hoping that they can catch some tailwind with that. And yeah, it's unfortunate because it just leads to nothing but confusion and distrust.
Definitely.
Great stuff, guys. Yeah, so much of what you touched on in the middle of your conversation, I just wrote about based on all this information that we had evaluated and analyzed and distilled. So we'll look at that at the end of this. But the second question here are, what are your top challenges in managing and using AI software? So respondents were more likely to say that difficulties with data management was their top challenge compared to data archiving. So over 720, roughly 720% more likely to say data management was a greater challenge compared to data archiving. A 368% greater likelihood to say that data management was a greater challenge compared to lack of transparency, and a 127% more likely to say it against data set management. So again, this gets back to everything that you guys were just talking about. What AI can provide is a way to mitigate those difficulties with data management. And yet there still seems to be that hesitancy, as we're going to see the next slide. But anything that you'd like to touch on here, either of you?
Well, I'll just and John, as I think this has been a passion play for us at Brain+Trust. I mean, we absolutely have gone out to try to help companies wrangle all their primary data that they have in the organization with a customer data platform or some other type of data lake or data unifying solution, right? And obviously, to what we were just talking about with artificial intelligence, if you do have your house in order, right? If you've got confident data archiving with data governance on top of that, right? That the entire organization understands, because this shouldn't be left to IT or a privacy and risk management group. This should be something that everyone understands, and they're fluid and fluent in data literacy. They have to be, to understand that if they are going to achieve that point of having a true north, a singular customer record for every customer, prospective and ongoing known customers, if they're going to do that, then there's benefit across the organization, and there's an incredible opportunities to structure that data for AI and general ongoing machine learning to work to the greater benefit of the organization. And again, we can talk about that in general terms, but I mean, I'm interested in if Dave's got anything to add to that when it comes to B2B marketing and demand generation. It's all related, having the entire stack, if it were, talking to each other.
Yeah, amazingly. I don't want to out too many of our customers, but there's, out of the thousands of customers that we have, there are literally dozens that do that extremely well. Most are in a state of flux and clearly attempting to get to that. But I think if you were asking and or having an honest discussion with many of those organizations, they'll be transparent, saying they're not where they need to be. They don't have a clear true north organizationally. Maybe their department does, but yet you go outside of the department, there's no organizational buy-in. So then arguably, do you have anything at all? And so on. Yeah, I feel like we're still a ways away. And it comes back to some of the things that we've talked about, right? There's a lot of confusion as to what technologies do. I commonly am always talking about, from a MarTech perspective, there's now 10,000 plus vendors in the space, most of which a year after deployment never turned itself into being a tool for you as a marketer. It was just left as a toy. You were enchanted by the value prop, the AI that was supposedly there. And then you purchase, you're a year into deployment, you realize, wow, this does nothing actually. I've got to do everything myself. John and I have a recent experience with a vendor we won't name that their value prop is far different than the actual customer experience. And so that then ripples out into your perception of every future vendor. And so it becomes harder and harder to trust anyone when you're going through these types of experiences. On the internal perspectives, though, yeah, I really wish marketers were further along. I suppose it could come back to the fact that the average tenure of a CMO is less than 3 years. And so if you've got constant churn and burn at the C-suite, that means you've got constant disruption into a strategic vision, and that North Star is not static, right? It's changing.
Right.
And so that therein by voids the concept of having a North Star.
Yeah, difficulties with data management. It's oftentimes, in this case, look in the mirror and being able to see exactly what your specific challenge is internally, as opposed to just, oh, it's not just difficulties with data management in terms of AI software. It is difficulties with data management across the board.
I do find it interesting, John, that data management was cited as a larger challenge than understanding how the algorithms learn and become more complex. To me, that's, I don't know, maybe I'm the pessimistic fear monger over here, but singularity is a thing, right? And so
absolutely it is. Yeah.
At some point, if left without a transparent lens into how things are changing and what it's doing with its knowledge, that does get to be scary. I would love to learn more about that.
We'll try to get Ray Kurzweil in the next one.
There you go.
But yeah, and we touch on it a little bit again in the blog. There's only 2.7% of all respondents said that the ethical usage of AI was one of their top priorities. I don't want to dive into that too deeply, but it aligns with exactly what you were just talking about, Dave. So the last thing that I want to dive into before, and again, Tim, thanks very much for your time, for joining us, Dave, likewise as well. The time frame for additional investment in AI software. So let's start with the bottom one. Respondents were over 1,000% more likely to say they'd wait over a year to invest in additional or even just invest in AI software at all, compared to those who were ready to jump basically in the next quarter. Compared to that, just under a third of all respondents said that they have an AI-related investment coming up within the next year. This gets back to everything that we've been talking about. The market is there. There's a real interest for it, but there seems to be that, to use the term, there's a bit of a trigger shyness. I don't know guns, so I don't really know that term, but there's people are nervous about what that investment might mean for their organization. As Dave just said, if you are hesitant about a vendor in an area that might not be explicitly AI related, how can you really compare it to something that might be way over your head? And you look at it and say, this is really terrific and it has all these bells and whistles, but how do I really know this is going to work out for me in this next year? So lots to dig into in this last piece.
What's intriguing here, John, to me is I'm almost taking the opposite perspective on this, and that 32% of the audience specifically said that they have a project within the next 12 months dedicated to AI investments. That's high in my mind, knowing the fact that no matter what market segment we go into, the vast majority of anyone's target prospects or ICPs are not going to be in market for a project, right? Timing is everything. And so it's interesting. And as we perform more of these across different segments, it'll be interesting to see how that in market percentage compares to other software disciplines. It seems
I totally agree. And I think the fact that if they say they're waiting 12 plus months, I don't know. I think folks are being more pragmatic today, which I think is a good thing. But I also think there is enough of a signal that we're seeing here that folks are actually taking it serious and they're understanding that they need to do it now. And I'll just bring it right back into context, because I know this has happened since you guys really brought in all this information from your research, right? But just and here we are, the first week of November of 2021, and we're on about 90 days of NFT craze, of people being they're being quickly educated on blockchain technology that doesn't have anything to do with Bitcoin, right? I mean, it does it to a certain degree, but it's not all about cryptocurrency. It's about art. It's about collectibles, and it's about products and physical things that have value, you know. And I'm not one who is throwing the baby out with the bathwater and running to NFTs, but it's just another shiny object on the heels of a couple of years that gave us things like Clubhouse and TikTok, and who knows what social network Donald Trump, you know, will have so much of his base go to, right? And I don't mean that as anything political. It's just that there's been some great fragmentation, and there's been some shooting stars and some shiny objects that have come on the radar to see that folks are, that if you read hesitation in these numbers, that could be the reason people are saying, how's this going to play out? But I'm with Dave. I think this number up top here, that a third of folks have said, hey, we've got it on the dashboard. We've got it on the roadmap for the next 12 months. That companies are starting to say, hey, we've got to do this. Dave said it earlier, singularity is a thing. I don't know if people are calling it that, but they're understanding that we have to have our data together, and we have to employ technology to help us do more, maybe do more with less, do more faster and clearer. Absolutely.
Yeah, all fascinating stuff that we've dug into here. All of this is available at blog.netline.com under the 2021 AI investment trends. There's also going to be a PDF that has more information in there as well. That's it for analyzing the consumption trends of IT buyers from the first half of 2021. Thank you both very much for your time. Tim, before we let you go, and again, everyone, Tim has a book called The Mobile Commerce Revolution, which he wrote with Tom Webster. It's one of my favorite books about mobile strategy, not just because it's about mobile strategy in terms of what is in your hand. It's about how people are actually mobile and how they go about their lives and their activities. So, Tim, aside from your awesome book, where can people find you, and what would you like people to do once they do find you?
Well, I want everybody to subscribe to my Sunday sermon. No, I'm just kidding. I get really preachy, 11 o'clock Central. No, I would say Brain+Trust Partners is our website. There is a slow but growing amount of content that we share there. On Twitter, I am the Tim Hayden. Great place to catch up with me. And I do pop up just about anywhere else. I mean, if you see me anywhere, please reach out, ask me a question. Anything we discussed today, someone wants to challenge me on. And I appreciate, John, everything you said about the book, because when Tom and I wrote that book, we were made it about consumer behavior, not mobile technology. We knew that would all change as we've discussed in the context of this conversation today. It's never going to be the same. It's always going to iterate. And that book still today, I still get people calling me and saying, you were spot on. The human nature has not changed, but the human behavior will, and that's what you have to keep your eye on.
Yeah, awesome stuff. You're a great first-party advocate. Dave, as always, thank you very much. And to everyone who listened and watched, thanks very much for your time as well. Take care.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks.